Another abuse scandal rocks the Roman Catholic Church. As the Pope's right-hand man faces sexual assault charges, we ask if the Vatican has failed to protect children. I'm Imran Garda, and today's newsmaker is Cardinal George Pell. Pope Francis promised to prevent abuse and punish priests responsible for it. But the pontiff's zero-tolerance approach now faces its biggest test. The Vatican's treasurer, Cardinal George Pell, has left his duties to face charges of sexual assault in Australia spanning back decades. He strongly denied the accusations, and his supporters call it a witch hunt. But the world will be watching to see how the Pope responds. So, what do these charges mean for the Church? Has it hurt the legitimacy of the organization that shepherds the world's Catholics? And will the alleged victims ever have their day in court? Yvette McCullough reports.
Another damning sexual abuse scandal for the Holy See, this time hanging over one of its most powerful figures. Cardinal George Pell, the Vatican's top financial advisor, is returning to Australia to face multiple charges for historical sexual offences. Pell denies the allegations and says he's been the victim of a relentless character assassination.
I'm looking forward finally to having my day in court. I'm innocent of these charges. They are false. The whole idea of sexual abuse is abhorrent to me.
Cardinal Pell is the highest-ranked Vatican official to face such charges. For years, he's faced questions over his role in the Australian Church's staggering scale of sexual abuse. Between 1950 and 2015, 7% of Australian priests were accused of abusing more than 4,440 children. And he has in the past also been accused of knowing about and covering up widespread clergy abuse when he was Archbishop of Melbourne and later Sydney.
All along, I have been completely consistent and clear in my total rejection of these allegations.
When Pope Francis took office in 2013, he promised reforms to prevent these atrocities ever happening again, and to sack those found guilty of abuse or of covering it up.
Tradisce il corpo del Signore.
A priest who does this betrays the body of the Lord. A priest needs to lead children to sanctity, and children trust him. But instead of leading them to sanctity, he abuses them. I will make a comparison. It's like a satanic mass.
But critics such as Marie Collins, an Irish survivor of clergy sexual abuse, who quit Pope Francis's commission to protect children, says that so far there hasn't been an enormous amount of change, with many of his proposals running into a brick wall of Vatican opposition. Now, with one of his top advisors facing charges, Pope Francis's commitment to take action faces its biggest test. And so far, it seems the Vatican is standing by Pell.
The Holy See expresses its respect for the Australian justice system, which will have to decide the merits of the questions raised. At the same time, it is important to recall that Cardinal Pell has openly and repeatedly condemned as immoral and intolerable the acts of abuse committed against minors.
Is the Catholic Church committed to change and to doing enough to protect young people? Or do these charges underline the pontiff's lack of true progress? Yvette McCullough, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now from Chicago by Barbara Blaine. She's the founder of the Survivors Network for those abused by priests. In Rome, we have Vatican Affairs correspondent Gerard O'Connell. And from London, Keith Porteous-Wood, the Executive Director of the UK National Secular Society. Thanks all of you for joining us. Gerard O'Connell, if I can begin with you, sir. These are very strong charges against Cardinal Pell. Do you believe them?
Well, certainly there are very strong charges. We don't know exactly what the specific charges are. We know there are criminal charges relating to past historical abuse. The courts have not revealed yet what specific charges are. They said there are many, and by many complainants. So I believe that perhaps tomorrow we will know what the specific charges are. There is much speculation in the press as to what those charges might be, but until we hear the specific ones, it is difficult to comment.
Okay, so let me reframe the question then. Reframe it and rephrase it. These are very disturbing allegations against the number 3 at the Vatican involving historic child sex abuse. Are you concerned about that? Do you believe it might be true?
Well, everybody is concerned about it here in the Vatican. I'm not a Vatican employee, I'm a journalist, but I understand, and I'm speaking to many people here, there is grave concern. The Victoria police have decided to press charges. The magistrates will now hear the charges. Cardinal Pell will be back in Australia in the coming days to face the court. As I said earlier, I cannot speculate on what specific charges are, since not even in Australia do people know what those charges. There are many charges in the public media in past times, but nobody knows on which specific one of these the police have decided to press the charge.
Barbara Blaine, innocent until proven guilty, and Pell is confident he'll be let off. What do you think?
Well, I think that obviously, as Gerard said, we don't know what those charges actually are, and we really don't know the truth, and everyone should be considered innocent until proven guilty. However, I think that there is sufficient evidence that Cardinal Pell has been involved in a long history of covering up sexual abuse allegations, of not reporting allegations and alleged perpetrators to police, and in transferring those who have been validly accused. He's transferred them to new assignments where more allegations have arisen. Mm-hmm. And he has not accepted responsibility for that. And that in and of itself was already enough reason for him to have stepped down. In fact, it's even questionable why Pope Francis would have appointed him back in 2014 when there was such a cloud hanging over Cardinal Pell for his cover-up and his history in Australia.
Keith Porteous-Wood, is the Church doing the right thing in standing by him because he is innocent until proven guilty, and they haven't come out and been outspoken and they haven't condemned him?
Yes, we should always presume innocence, but this is not the most important thing, as Barbara Blaine has just said. It's about the role of the Vatican overall, and particularly of the Pope. And the Pope, as she said, allowed him to be, picked him out of all of the people who could have done this job. He picked Pell with this terrible history, which has been confirmed by the Victorian Commission. And this also needs to be seen in the light of his recent appointment of the Archbishop to take over the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, who himself has got form on covering up child abuse. That needs to be added to his appointment of a commission, the Pope's Commission, with just 2 victims on it to look over these issues. They've departed in disgust. The Pope didn't need to appoint a commission to find out what to do with about child abuse. The United Nations, I hold it here, the United Nations gave them 70 paragraphs of what to do. And what was the Vatican's attitude to that? A, not to accept them, and B, to attack the committee of experts from around the world. And that was disgraceful.
Okay, Gerard,
tells us everything we need to know about the. I've just finished. Tell us everything we need to know. Actions are stronger than words about what the Pope really thinks about child abuse and for justice for victims and for perpetrators.
Okay, undoubtedly. Now, Gerard, to the point that was made by the other 2 guests, They're talking about the fact that the man was appointed to the position when he was already under a cloud. Now, Pell was not only accused of molesting boys himself.
I think you have to actually...
If I could just finish the question, please, sir. 20 seconds, right? So not only accused of molesting boys himself, but 2 of the Vatican's 9-member Council of Cardinals are alleged to have turned a blind eye, right, to child sex abuse undertaken by priests under their jurisdiction. So they shuffled them off to other places. And one of them was Cardinal Pell, the other Cardinal Javier Errázuriz, formerly the Archbishop of Santiago. So both put in the council by Pope Francis. So what the other 2 are saying is Pope Francis, even before these allegations now, Pope Francis knew there was a cloud hanging over not only Pell, but another cardinal as well, yet he still appointed them to the council. To them, it suggests that the Vatican doesn't take this seriously enough and the Church is not doing enough to protect children. Would you accept that argument?
I think this is a false argument, because the Pope Francis was elected in March 2013. Within 6 days of his election, at the request of many cardinals, he created a council of cardinal advisors. He chose one from each continent. Cardinal Pell was the only one he could have chosen from Oceania and Australia.
So do you agree that he was tarnished, but the Pope had no choice?
At that time, if you will actually look back, the picture we have today was not the picture that was then there. Cardinal Pell has always been a controversial figure in Australia, but it was in that same year, 2013, that the Royal Commission started, and they actually have interviewed Cardinal Pell 3 times. The last one was in Rome in 2016, February. I was at that, I followed it. It is interesting that even though the Victoria Police investigated for 2 years, it took them 2 years to come to the conclusion that he could be charged. So with all this investigation, was the Pope expected to say that I will not appoint this man because I consider him guilty? We don't yet know if Cardinal Pell is guilty. There are lots of allegations. There are lots of stories. I followed them over several years. And the picture is not good. Nobody claims the picture is good. But when the Pope appointed Cardinal Pell, this picture was not as clear as we have it today. And as he said on the plane returning from Poland in July, he said there are doubts. And when there are doubts, the accused has to be given the advantage on the doubts.
Barbara, all things considered, in the year 2017, after everything you've heard, has the Church failed victims of sexual abuse, victims such as yourself?
Of course, there's no question that the Church has and continues to fail the victims, but that's not most important. What is most important is that the Church officials allow sexual perpetrators to remain in ministry today, and that children remain at risk today. And that is what is just horrific and has to be stopped. And for whatever reason, Pope Francis and Vatican officials seem to have blinders over their faces. They just refuse to see the obvious. And given the track record, why on earth would they even risk putting someone with a cloud behind him? Why would you put someone with a cloud over them into a position of high authority within the Church? It is time to open those files that the Vatican holds, turn them over to police from every nation, and join together with prosecutors. Let's prosecute the sexual perpetrators and put them in jail. Let's clean up the Church once and for all. Let's punish bishops who cover up and who enable and transfer perpetrators.
So let's get Gerard. Can you honestly disagree with any of that?
Barbara,
I think the Pope agrees with Barbara that if a person is clearly guilty. He should face the justice. The Pope has made very clear, as he said, returning from the flight from the Holy Land, there will be no daddy's boys in this pontificate.
Right. But
he said,
but Barbara is saying, why
if a
risk
person
it, sir?
is
She's
guilty,
saying, why
he
risk
has
it?
to face the courts. But he must be... The Pope has also, in 2016, June, has introduced a legislation in the Church that if a bishop is is considered judged to have neglected to protect children, or has been omitted in the protection of children, he can be removed from office. And the Pope has instructed 4 Vatican departments to follow up on any charges against this.
Okay, and those are the
Barbara
efforts.
knows that in the United States, in that same year, the 2 bishops in St. Paul, Minneapolis were removed, and also the bishop in Kansas City.
That is encouraging.
Other people have been
Certainly,
removed.
Gerard.
The problem with the
Gerard,
Vatican is they do not make public much of this.
Certainly. Gerard, if I could come in, because, and this is what the others are saying, there are some encouraging moves, but they feel it's not enough, especially since in the year 2017, under Pope Francis, when everybody thought the church was moving in a positive direction, you still have these horrendous allegations that are resurfacing. Let me bring in Keith Portia.
Imran.
Keith, come in. You want to talk?
Imran, the two points that Barbara made were in this report from the UN about making all these secret archives available to prosecuting authorities, to removing from office people who've been accused and suspending them. The Pope also had a tribunal for bishops, and it's never met, and it was just a way of avoiding them going to being sent to criminal secular authorities. That's where they should all be going. And an important point that I've found from every lawyer I have spoken to who's dealing with these issues of those abused by the Catholic Church, in every case, they are saying that the Church plays hardball against people they know perfectly well have been abused, and refuse to give them compensation and compound the abuse they've already settled. And those instructions must be coming from the top.
I think this is disproved in the United States. If you check in the United States,
no,
how
that's
much
truly
money has
not
gone to the
true. In
victims?
the United States, that's not true. No, that's not true. When those bishops stepped down,
What's
actually,
not true, Barbara? What's not true?
The issues of the sexual abuse, what's not true is that those bishops who stepped down did so because of allegations of sexual abuse. They stepped down for other reasons, and one of them, the one from Kansas City, even was permitted 2 months later to ordain the next class of new priests who had to pledge their allegiance and obedience to the very bishop who had stepped down. And he was permitted to step down. He wasn't removed, and he wasn't really punished, and either were those bishops in the Twin Cities. And so it's simply not true to portray that as some type of punishment and hold out hope that means that bishops somehow are being punished, because the bare minimum has happened to those bishops here in the U.S., and that was only after a long period of time.
And the Church in the States has openly campaigned to stop the relaxation of the statute of limitations on child abuse, to make it more difficult for these charges, both criminally and civilly, to be brought. They've had the gall to do that openly and actually campaign and pay people to campaign in legislatures. Right. And I think that's one of the most disgraceful things I've ever seen.
Okay, I want to bring this almost back to the beginning here, because
within
invariably...
the church law, that limitation is no longer
sir.
existing.
Okay, Gerard, if you'd allow me to bring this back to the beginning.
Yes.
Right, so we start out with Cardinal Pell. Invariably, when a cardinal is under scrutiny, if a cardinal's on trial, the church is on trial. And you know, this becomes a very big discussion. I want to kind of bring it back to Cardinal Pell now and ask you, Barbara, if you're aware of what Cardinal Timothy Dolan of New York said about Cardinal Pell. He was interviewed very recently. He said, "I don't want to believe the charges against Pell, and Pell's willingness to cooperate with the judicial process and acknowledge he's not above the law only shows the mettle of a great man He also said, I appreciate him, I admire him, and I want to stick with him. And my emphasis on the Cardinal saying, I want to stick with him. What do you think of that, Barbara?
I think that Cardinal Dolan himself has a huge history of cover-up and of knowingly transferring perpetrator priests. And it started way back decades ago when he was the bishop over in St. Louis. Then he went to Milwaukee, where he had a horrific tenure for the victims and assisted in ensuring that victims in Wisconsin, the state, would never see justice. And then he went on to New York, where he continues in supporting those who have been accused. And so it seems like the pot, you know, like the fire calling the pot black. It seems crazy for to look at Cardinal Dolan as someone who we should believe when he has the cloud hanging over himself.
Right. Gerard O'Connell, very finally, please, sir, right? I mean, I know, and especially in the context of this debate, you've been, you know, on the defensive here because the other two are on the other side in many ways in this debate. I want to ask you, you're in the Vatican, you're in the Vatican City. You're a journalist, yes, you don't represent the Vatican, but if the Pope had to call you in and say, we have a mess on our hands, how can we fix this? How can we make this better? What would you advise him to do, sir?
Well, I think the Pope has set out the path that should be followed. That, first of all, any allegation must be investigated immediately, because we have to believe children. This has not happened in the past. The Church admits now that in the past they did not believe, they did not listen to children.
And you can all agree on that, right? You can all agree on that you have to believe children first. Yes?
Of course.
Then
yes,
secondly,
but the Pope himself doesn't do that.
Why do you say that?
His actions do not equal his words.
This is really a misconception, because he has, since he has become Pope, he has, first of all, changed the law in terms of negligent bishops. Secondly, he has set up a commission to protect children, to advise him, but also to go to the bishops' conferences around the world to advise them and ensure that they have structures in place which will safeguard children. Thirdly, he has prosecuted, brought to the Vatican, and the nuncio from the Dominican Republic in 2016 and put him in jail and put him on trial. Fourthly, he has made very clear that if you're a cardinal, if you're a bishop, you will still be committed, you still have to face justice. And fifthly, there are actually two tribunals in the Vatican. There is the tribunal that hears the first case, and then there is the second tribunal, which is an appeals tribunal. And in terms of bishops, the Pope is the one who takes the final decision. And he has made this very clear, that he will not tolerate the abuse of children.
Okay. Okay. Gerard, Barbara, and Keith, I wish we could go on with this discussion, because it's been really good talking to all of you. Unfortunately, I've got to move on. I thank you all for your time. Still to come on the Newsmakers, Hong Kong's identity crisis. 20 years after the handover, is the city's distinct culture under threat from Beijing? And Qatar rejects all the demands from the Saudi-led bloc. Is the crisis escalating? Welcome back to the Newsmakers. It sounds obvious, but it's contentious. Hong Kong is not your average Chinese city. Compared to much of the rest of China, it has its own language, cuisine, and schooling system. After the handover, Beijing hoped the city would reintegrate into China seamlessly. But that hasn't happened, and China's efforts to reunify the city from the top down by trying to shape the curriculum and spread Mandarin only seem to have backfired. That's prompted some into politics. For others, it's led to a fear that the city's distinct identity is slowly being eroded. Natalie Perhonen has this special report from Hong Kong.
The lion dance is meant to bring good fortune and good health. This particular style has been passed down in the Hung family for 13 generations.
The Chinese martial arts is one of our very important traditions in China and even in Hong Kong.
Each Sunday, these boys aged from 11 to 17 years old spend hours practicing the discipline.
In a fast-moving environment here in Hong Kong, people used to keep moving very quickly, and they used to may not be sticks to one thing in a very long time. So we hope we can keep this generation, keep this martial art, this style, keep it going, because we don't want to waste our grand master over 400 years times. They've been trying hard to pass this martial art and kung fu and the workout to us.
Tradition blends with modernity in this cutting-edge city. Out on the streets of the Mong Kok district, we asked people how they would define what it means to be a local.
A city person, mainly, well, it's a really busy city, it's really crowded.
My feeling to Hong Kong is just local, yeah, without any connection to maybe China, maybe.
Ask locals here where they're from and they'll almost always tell you they're Hong Kongers. It's a relatively new term. It was added to the Oxford English Dictionary in 2014, and it means a native or inhabitant of Hong Kong. In this city, it's also a reminder that there's a clear divide between locals and mainlanders. Eastern and Western values are a part of Hong Kong identity. One aspect of the culture here you can't physically see is the right to expression. Cantonese pop stars Denise Ho and Anthony Wong were actively involved in the umbrella movement. They say the ability to openly discuss politics and express yourself is under threat.
Like somehow within these few years, all the values and all that the culture that we had, like somehow we realized that it's slipping away from us and it's been taken away from us. So that was when, you know, people in Hong Kong started to realize that we have to grab on, to hold on to these values.
As artists, they say there's a pressure to conform to government views.
In our days of a colony, we were not really censored. But now we are getting a lot of censorship from external or self-censorship.
Since the handover, scores of mainland tourists and workers have come to the city. While rituals like dim sum, drinking tea and eating with the family are an essential part of the culture shared on both sides of the border, Beijing's push for more Chinese history and Mandarin education in schools has been labelled by some activists as the mainlandization of Hong Kong. And it's turned preserving Hong Kong culture into a political issue.
I think the identity has not yet changed, but the government, especially the Chinese government, had long been attempt to intervene, and they try to convert people from a citizen with strong civic consciences to merely a patriotic nationals to the party state of China.
This cultural clash is also having an effect on how people from the mainland are viewed. 25-year-old Yuan Chun from Nanjing has been working here for 4 years.
Actually, most of my Hong Kong friends, they have some very negative view about the mainland China. From the papers, the media, they just have very huge negative point of view of China.
Adding yet another layer of complexity to what it means to be a Hong Konger. Natalie Pohonen, The Newsmakers, Hong Kong.
Well, joining me now from Hong Kong is leader of the Liberal Party, Felix Cheung Kwok Pan. He's a member of the Legislative Council, also a director at the Hong Kong Design Centre and an advisor to the city's fashion industry. And in London, Professor Steve Chang, he's the director of the China Institute at London School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, and he specializes in Hong Kong's relations with mainland China. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Steve Chang, if I can start with you, does Hong Kong have an identity crisis?
Hong Kong has a very strong, clear sense of identity. It isn't exactly necessarily an identity crisis in the sense of people not knowing what they actually are or what they want to be. Where there is an issue is that the Chinese government is trying to impose a different sense of identity onto Hong Kong, to the extent that they actually want the local Hong Kong sense of identity to be completely subordinate to the sense of identity as citizens of the People's Republic of China. That's where the problem lies.
Okay. Felix, is Beijing trying to impose an identity on Hong Kongers?
No, I don't think so, because everybody knows that all the Hong Kong people are Chinese, but we just classify ourselves as Hong Kong Chinese. So there's no identity problems whether we are from China. Of course, we are not from China, but most of our generation, our older generations, are from China. So there's no identity problem, but the only problem is the young people nowadays concentrate more on the one. If you're talking about one country, two system, we focus more on the two systems rather than one country. But now China wants us to recognize one country is the priority. Without one country, there's no two systems. Well, that's the only contradictions that we have right now.
Mm-hmm. Do you think, Felix, that China can tolerate, with one country, two systems, Beijing can tolerate an independent, confident Hong Kong identity?
I don't think so. I mean, China give us a lot of rooms for us to for the Hong Kong government to rule ourselves. But in the last few years, a small percentage of the Hong Kong people are looking for what they call independence, but which is most of the Hong Kong people do not agree with that. And we totally think that we are all Chinese, we belong to China. Mm-hmm. So, of course, China is not happy with those people who's talking about independence. So they have certain criteria, want the Hong Kong government to do a lot more educations or national educations to tell the people how important China is.
Okay, Felix, there's a poll every year, right, by University of Hong Kong. June 2016, a poll found 31% of people in Hong Kong said they 31% of people said they felt proud to be Chinese nationals. That tells you 69% of people didn't feel proud to be Chinese nationals. Tell me what's behind that, Felix.
No. The analysis can be like this. There is another post by another university, another universities. So whether Hong Kong people still support the one country, two systems. 70% of the Hong Kong people still support one country, two systems. And 17% of the people, young people especially, they want independent. And also, another 13% of the people want one country, one systems. Right. So, I mean, if you just saying that 31% of the people enjoy to be Chinese, but you cannot say that the other 67% will not say no. But the reason, there is a recent research, a recent poll saying that those 70% of the young people who want Hong Kong independent has been dropped. Okay. And now it's about 11%. Okay. So I mean, the poll's been changing all the time.
Okay, so Steve, I gave Felix a few stats. He has an interpretation of them. He still believes that one country, two systems with an overall Chinese identity is the way to go. Tell me why you disagree, Steve.
What Felix had provided is a fantastically clear and wonderful representation of the views of the Chinese government, which is exactly why the problem exists. People feel what they feel. By simply saying that a long-standing opinion poll that has been running ever since 1997, and in fact even before the handover, is no longer valid because the facts do not suit their particular argument, does not change the facts on the ground. That's the kinds of arguments that President Trump would be very proud to make. The movement in Hong Kong for independence is indeed very, very small. But what is even more important was that there wasn't even anything like any advocacy for independence in Hong Kong if you only go back, say, 5 years. The younger generations of people in Hong Kong are coming out and ask for independence because they were pushing back against what they saw as deliberate government policy to introduce brainwashing in Hong Kong.
Okay, what do you mean by brainwashing, Steve?
Patriotic education.
Steve, give me an example,
campaign.
right? When you say brainwashing, what do you mean? Do you mean the imposition of Mandarin? Because some might say, hey, Mandarin's a language, and this is pragmatic. Why not learn the language, Putonghua as they call it? Why not learn it and enrich yourself? Nobody's suppressing Cantonese. Is that what you mean by brainwashing?
No. Language is not the issue here. Schools in Hong Kong now generally teach Mandarin. Cantonese is the lingua franca, it's the local language that people normally speak anyway. But they're happy to be learning Mandarin. Nobody really take particular issues with that. Where they did take issues from very young kids, we're talking about children themselves organizing, was when the government tried to impose a new school curriculum that teaches contemporary Chinese histories in a way that even teenagers in Hong Kong could see that that's just not true.
Okay.
And they wanted a proper education where they would be allowed to think for themselves.
Let's ask Felix then. Felix, are Hong Kongers being brainwashed by Beijing?
Of course, no. I mean, I totally disagree with that statement. I mean, what happening was about 5 years ago when the new government, at that time, the new government wanted to introduce the national history on the curriculum on the secondary school. But I mean, there was some argument on the content of it. I mean, but the content can be discussable. Hong Kong is a very liberal city, so national history was not put in the syllabus of the secondary school. So the Hong Kong government just want to put it back. Now is not compulsory, and everything can be revised and negotiated. So I mean, there's nothing happened just like what the other gentleman said, the brainwashing. Never happened in Hong Kong.
Steve Chang, as we talk about culture wars, to what extent have Hong Kongers exacerbated the problem by, for example, referring to Chinese from the mainland who come on holiday as locusts on social media, by talking about them as being dirty for eating on the subway, and so on? Has that contributed to the problem, Steve?
That is a manifestation of the problem more than the original source of the problem. It certainly doesn't help, because in terms of relationship between the people of Hong Kong and the people of the mainland China, they really need to have mutual respect for each other. There are completely different ways of life and different ways of doing things. Hong Kong, in many ways, have embraced core values that they have inherited from the time when Hong Kong was a British territory. The rights of individuals, freedom, rule of law, and respect for each other, and that includes certain behavior. And when you have sometimes some Chinese visitors, not by any means all Chinese visitors, but a small number of Chinese visitors who go to Hong Kong and they simply behave the way they normally behave in China, they sometimes cause very serious problems with the local people, because the local people will see that as being extremely rude and not well-educated behavior. Now, that sort of things are problems, but that is not the kind of problems that really is driving the rise of a very strong sense of identity, which underpins a small number of young people who ask for independence. In a place where everybody knows independence is not an option. The young people asking for independence knows that that's not going to happen. But they are very, very angry with the way how the Chinese government and people who are speaking on behalf of the Chinese government simply ignore what they think and how they feel and impose something on them and simply tell them that if you don't think the way that we think, you should think.
Okay.
There's some problems with you.
Okay, so Felix, isn't that reasonable? They don't want independence. All they want is to be respected as Hong Kongers with a separate identity. Still one country, two systems. They just want Beijing to listen a bit more. Isn't that reasonable?
You know, all the young people always have what they required, or they are very ideal on certain things. This is reasonable, but it's the way that they present, I think, has the problems. They can, of course, express their view, but I mean, whether this is the right way to express the will, a lot of the Hong Kong people think that is not the correct way. Everybody in Hong Kong understand that there's no way that Hong Kong can be independent, so they can request the government to do a lot more. I mean, the government can be have rooms to improve. They can, through the Hong Kong government, to talk to the central government to express the view, but to express the way saying independent, I don't think is the correct way.
Unfortunately, I've got to wrap. Gentlemen, I thank you very much. Thanks so much for joining us.
Qatar stands ready to engage in a negotiations process with a clear framework and set of principles that guarantee that our sovereignty is not infringed upon.
First came the blockade, then the demands, then the response. Qatar says what the GCC ordered it to do was unrealistic and unachievable. They won't be closing Al Jazeera, a Turkish army base, or scaling back ties to Iran and so-called terror groups. In fact, the Qatari foreign minister says the fight against terror is the country's biggest priority. Saudi Arabia and its allies have been meeting in Cairo to plan their next move. And are we likely to see an escalation in what's already the worst diplomatic crisis in the Gulf in decades? Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now from London by Qatar's ambassador to Australia, Nasser bin Hamad Mubarak Al Khalifa. Sir, good to have you on the program. We heard from your foreign minister that your position is unchanged, but are you considering maybe meeting them halfway, or maybe even 10% of the way, to give the Saudis and their GCC allies something, anything, because these are very powerful countries making very serious threats against you?
First of all, thank you for having me, sir. And as to our position are very clear. It was sent to the parties involved in the blockade of Qatar, i.e. the Saudis and the Emiratis and Bahrain and Egypt. And we are ready to negotiate and to discuss any issues which concern their security or any other issues which they feel uncomfortable with. But there are certain issues which cannot be negotiated, and these include what is our rights under the Charter of the United Nations, i.e. our sovereignty, our independence, our right to run our foreign policy according to the interest of our people. Having said that, we are ready to discuss any issues. We are ready to sit with them anywhere. We are ready to accept any arbitration. We are ready to facilitate the work of the Kuwaiti under Sheikh Sabah al-Sabah. And we are even ready to have the United Nations involvement to solve these issues. And to find out who really have the right and who have not, because we found ourselves just being under blockade, having relation with our countries being severed, and having our people under severe condition.
Sir, did the blockade come to you as a shock?
Yes, sir, because a few days before that, you know, the Emir was with the GCC leadership for their summit. Then they had summit with the President of the United States, where they agreed on certain principles to fight terrorism and to cooperate. And everybody agreed to that. And then after that, there was a larger meeting, which included all the Islamic states and the President of the United States. And the Emir was there, and we all agreed to the same principle, and we accepted all our obligations, and everything seemed to be right. A few days later, we woke up after midnight in Ramadan, while we were fasting, to find out somebody hacked into our national news agencies and fabricated a speech which His Highness never said. And when we were able to correct things, and we contacted the Saudis, the Emiratis, and all the GCC, and we said, we've been under attack. There was a cyber attack, and somebody put disinformation. And of course, and we contacted you, we contacted all the international agencies, and everybody was kind enough to echo what we have said, except the Saudi press and the UAE press, and the Egyptian and the Bahrainis.
Right. Given that this came as a shock to you, they took you by surprise, is the country making contingency plans for maybe an invasion or a coup attempt from the Saudis and their allies? Is that what's in the thinking right now?
Well, you know, thanks God, we were able to foil really a regime change. That's what they were after, because the way their campaign took place, the way they managed it, the way they were trying to discredit our system, our political system, our economic system, was really intended to have regime change. And that's why all the citizens of Qatar, they rallied behind their leadership, because they knew that the whole fabrication was intended to attack our leadership. So that is behind us now. Now, concerning any other erroneous activities by these parties, we are ready for any contingencies. We don't expect any invasion, but if somebody is thinking of that will be, you know, a repetition of what Saddam Hussein have done in 1999.
Are you sure, though? Are you sure that the Americans, or are you sure that the international community would rally to your defense as they did to defend Kuwait? Because it seems as if they have a lot of friends, and maybe the United States is on their side.
I think all our friends, including the American, the British, the European Union, everybody, the Russian and the Chinese and the Japanese, I think they are all supporting our position, and they will not allow such event to take place. Qatar now is a part of an international communities which you know, cannot allow a crisis to really get out of hand, and you know, and we are very sure of ourselves.
Yes, Ambassador, as you mentioned, you're a sovereign country, you're an independent country, that is not in question. But given that the coalition has major problems with you based on your policies, they have problems with Qatar hosting the Muslim Brotherhood, with Qatar hosting Hamas, for example. Well, Qatar may be having slightly warmer ties with Tehran than others. Given all of that, are there any regrets that maybe those policies were wrong, those policies weren't worth the trouble?
We haven't made mistakes to have regrets here. When it comes to the Muslim Brotherhood are ruling in Morocco. They are in the government. They are ruling. They are part of the government in Tunis. They are part of the legislative body of Kuwait, and also in the government. They are also in the legislative body of Bahrain, and they are in other countries. So, to us, I mean, these Muslim Brotherhood are not criminalized under the United Nations or under the majority of countries in the world. If these 3 countries or 4 countries want to criminalize them, that is their business. But they cannot impose on us something which has no place in reality and no place under international law. This is one. When it comes to Hamas and to other issues, they never mentioned Hamas now in their demands. But Hamas, there are 1 or 2 people, not many people. They are all political figures. And I think they have forgotten that we were asked by the American to welcome Hamas in Qatar because the other venue would be Tehran. So, you know, some of their allegations really have no basis. I mean, it is just fabrication to really impose their will on us, to out-resource our foreign policy, to make us a non-existent state, just in name, but not in reality.
So it's been a pleasure talking to Ambassador Nasser bin Hamad Mubarak Al Khalifa. Thank you for taking the time. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garta. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.